my name is Shayne Walton. I'm here with Champion Briefs, and I'll be discussing the topic of, in the United States, the private ownership of handguns ought to be banned. This topic was selected as the January-February topic, which is the most important topic, in my opinion, of the debate season. So for more information regarding the topic, a little bit more of an extensive topic analysis, and some evidence, be sure to check out our January-February briefs. But as you should do with every single debate topic, you should go through first and look at some of the key words, which is what we're going to do now. So the first word, or term of art actually, that stands out to me is the topic of private ownership. Private ownership implies in this resolution that the resolution is not discussing banning handguns forever for everyone in general. This is talking about individuals. So people like the police, the military, the government, etc. might not be the private ownership that we're looking towards there. So this helps specify the affirmative ground. The AF doesn't have to decide that they're getting rid of all handguns for everyone. They just have to get rid of individual handguns that are privately owned, for example, in your home. But police officers, on the other hand, will still be able to own these handguns and use them in their purposes. So the next big word in the resolution is the idea of handguns. Handguns are items such as pistols, or basically guns that can be held in one hand. So things like much larger weapons will not be discussed on this resolution, so that makes the affirmative ground get more specified. This leads to some difficulties in finding evidence, because you have to make sure you're not just talking about firearms in all of your evidence. You have to find evidence specific to handguns to show that you're actually solving for the problems that you're talking about. The next term, as always, is ought. Ought is defined by most debaters as a moral obligation. So what this does is it helps you set up the idea and need for a framework in the round, and it allows you to value morality. And then the very last word is banned. So I've seen this become a little bit of an issue on this topic because people are wondering, how are you going to go about banning it? So in your affirmative case, you might want to specify that you're banning this from now on. People can't buy handguns, or we're going to go back and get all the handguns that were previously owned and stop them in the future. It's all a matter of policy, and it'll allow you to get out of some negative ground, some negative disadvantages, if you're able to specify how you're going to be banning this. Because you don't want to allow for getting rid of, let's say, every handgun that's ever existed in the past, because that might be too much of a burden to put on the affirmative case, and might not be totally possible. So with these terms defined, we're able to see that the affirmative side of this topic will be defending individuals like you and me not owning handguns, which are guns you can hold in one hand, not usually used for hunting, etc., and through some means, for example, getting rid of all handguns previously owned, or just stopping handguns from being allowed to be sold in the future. But the negative side, on the other hand, can defend a plethora of different positions. You're able to defend specific people not being able to own handguns, or you're able to defend just everyone being allowed to have handguns, the status quo, etc. On the neg, your options are kind of limitless on this topic. So now that we know what the burdens of each side are, let's go on to speak about the different positions that are common on this topic. So starting with the affirmative, the first main case that I've seen is a utilitarianism affirmative. So there are a few good advantages. So the first thing you're going to be doing on these cases is obviously setting up a framework. You want to have a framework that has probably your value as morality and your value criterion as promoting well-being, or maximizing lives, or maximizing happiness. Something that shows you're going to be completing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So these advantages are going to be things like lives being lost through handguns. So for example, one common advantage is regarding suicides and homicides. There are a few studies that prove that for every 1% decrease in gun ownership, there's a 1% decrease in suicides and homicides. Also, there's authors that speak about how when you own a gun and you're more likely to make these rash decisions like committing suicide or murdering another individual, when you have means to a more lethal weapon. So if you had less lethal forces, there would be less actual deaths through these actions, and that would be probably overall better in terms of a utilitarian standpoint. Another advantage here is regarding kids. Kids get easy access when their parents don't lock up their guns properly. So for example, this can lead to an issue. So when you own guns, at least here in California, you're supposed to have your gun locked up in one area with no ammo in it, and have the other ammo locked up in another part of the house where only the owner of the gun, presumably the adult, has access to those codes. but typically people don't lock up their guns properly. And this allows for kids, as you've probably heard in the media, where they accidentally shoot their sibling or they accidentally shoot themselves. These are issues where people don't understand the concept of owning a gun and they don't have all the proper safeties in lock. So there are accidental shootings, which can obviously be decreased if people just did not own handguns in the first place. Another advantage is regarding intimate partner violence, or as debaters like to call it, IPV. So intimate partner violence is basically domestic violence, where an individual, the aggressor, attacks a person living in the home or their partner, and it can get lethal, and having handguns can be an issue in terms of the lethality of this intimate partner violence. So if we were to take away handguns, there'd probably be more survivors from intimate partner violence. Along with these arguments on the affirmative, you can also read a specific Kantian framework, but with more of a Ripstein flair. So what happens there is you can say that the government is allowed to restrict certain ends of individuals if it promotes better ends. So we were allowed to restrict handgun ownership in order to promote the end of having more people be alive. This is a means-based framework, however, so it would be, if you looked to Ripstein's Force and Freedom, you'd be able to find evidence regarding how the state, under a Kantian or means-based ethic, is more allowed to restrict specific ownership of handguns, same way that it stops you from it makes you stop at a stop sign. So you have to stop at a stop sign to make sure there's not accidents and to prevent this death by car crashes, for example. So the state would similarly be allowed to restrict handgun ownership in order to promote life in the long run, but on a means-based ethic rather than an ends-based ethic. Then there are also topics that you can look to with plan or parameterized version of the resolution. So for example, this last weekend at CPS, I saw people reading topics or affirmatives that were like 3D printed handguns must be banned because they can get through security at airports. Or I even heard one about elephants where the grips of handguns are made of ivory and that causes elephants to die and they're like a keystone species, for example. These are things to look into, but I would first start off researching the broad utilitarian and Kantian perspectives on the affirmative, and you'll be able to find plans as you go along. Don't initially look at a plan. Initially just look at the topic in general and you'll find a good one. So those are the topics on the affirmative that I find to be most persuasive. First, the utilitarian AC, which has the benefits of stopping suicides and homicides, stopping accidental shootings, stopping intimate partner violence, and then also the Kantian affirmative case where we can ban guns in order to promote the rights of individuals in the future, and also specific plan affirmatives are all very convincing to me. So then, now that you've done your affirmative research, you can look to the negative case. So there are so many options you have on the negative side of this topic. The first one that absolutely stood out to me as soon as I heard this topic was obviously a constitutionality NC, meaning you first have to set up a framework that justifies why the Constitution is morally important, why it's important for us to look to the Constitution when determining morality, especially because the topic gives us the benefit of saying in the United States. So in the United States, the main thing that policymakers must look to would be the Constitution. So we have to set up a framework and have it justify why the Constitution is important, and then you're able to look to the Second Amendment, which talks about how we must be allowed to have a well-regulated militia and have the right to bear arms in the United States to be able to fight back against a possibly tyrannical government. So what happens here is once you set up the framework of the Constitution being important, so long as you're able to show that doing the affirmative violates the Constitution, and then also likely would not be allowed to occur in America, you can see that as that happens, it violates the ethic that you've set up in the beginning of the round, and it's pretty hard for the affirmative to beat that back. There's nothing that really states that that America is allowed to ban guns for individuals. This also is proven because they had a handgun ban actually in Washington, D.C., and that handgun ban got overturned because it was unconstitutional. So there is actual empirical proof that the Supreme Court would say this is no, you cannot do this, this is not okay, to ban the rights of certain individuals to own guns. So that's a big benefit for the negative in this side. So constitutionality NC, in my opinion, is probably the most true negative argument and probably the most difficult to respond to as the affirmative case. You either have to say that something is more important than the Constitution, for example, saving lives, but then again, that's an issue in terms of the United States. Obviously, we need to look to the Constitution, so this argument can be brought up. Common affirmative arguments will talk about how the term well-regulated militia indicates that there needs to be regulations on the militia. However, I don't think that's very convincing looking back on the past court decisions stating that this is against the Constitution and not okay. So then, moving on, another negative position would be another Kantian perspective. So what an individual can do here is they can defend the topic and set up a Kantian framework and show that people need to have the freedom to own guns, and also that it's necessary for self-defense. So people can set up that self-defense is a very common usage of handguns. For example, sexual assault survivors and individuals who are being hurt by IPV, intimate partner violence, can use handguns as defense against their aggressors. And just in a normal situation, let's say you live in a bad neighborhood where you need to have a gun in case there is a robbery, etc., then you could have a handgun that can ultimately protect you. Kant defends the idea of self-defense and says it's actually very important for individuals to have the right to self-defense, especially in instances where they are specifically in danger. So this negative case can directly clash with the affirmative case that I spoke about earlier regarding the Ripstein framework, where you can ban a handgun in order to ban future violences. This would probably function as a turn against that framework and against that case, where you're able to advocate for people having self-defense, which is why they need to own handguns to promote their life in the future. The aggressor in this instance, in the case of the negative case, would give up their right to life when they attack another individual. When they try to kill another individual, they've given up their right to life, and the individual who's being attacked is allowed to fight back by means of self-defense under a Kantian framework. Another argument that I saw on this topic a lot that I've been seeing is the idea of counterplans. So this is offering a counter advocacy to the affirmative plan or their whole resolution affirmative. So I've seen counterplans that are, for example, a buyback program. This actually occurred recently in Australia. There was actually about a decade ago or two, there was a mass shooting that happened, and immediately after the mass shooting, they banned the private ownership of handguns, exactly what the topic says, and they instituted a buyback program. So individuals were allowed to go give their guns to the government and get money back, because the government was going to not just going to take their property, they were going to instead give them money back in return. This has been seen a few times actually in America. Certain cities have gone through and done this, but the results are mixed. So this is an important thing to do a lot of research on to determine if this is a counterplan that you would like to defend. Another counterplan that I've seen is regarding stopping people who have been the aggressors in intimate partner violence from being allowed to own guns in the future. There are certain laws that aren't very strict right now throughout America regarding this. For example, if you have a restraining order against you within the next few days, you should have to give up any gun that you own. But it's a lot harder to verify. So the counterplan advocates for a strict removal of guns from anyone who's been the aggressor in the case of intimate partner violence or has a restraining order against them. This would advocate for benefits such as decreasing domestic violence issues and overall just protecting more individuals, because if you've been the aggressor previously, you are likely to be the aggressor in the future, and that would be a very bad implication under a utilitarian framework. Another topic that has been brought up is regarding a stop and frisk disadvantage. So there are a plethora of disadvantages right now, especially in regards to the elections that are coming up, but I'll speak about that in a moment. The first one that I thought of on this topic was a stop and frisk disadvantage. So you might have heard a few years back when there was a lot of stop and frisk happening in New York specifically. So basically what happened there was the government gave the police officer permission to stop and frisk any individual on the street that they believe may be in possession of drugs or a weapon specifically. It's one of the reasons why it was instituted, was to get weapons that were unregistered out of the hands of people who might be criminals. But what happened along with this policy is police officers started stopping individuals who were minorities and males. There's a statistic out there that's like over 80% of the individuals who were stopped and frisked in those areas were minority groups. Along with that, in those stops, they only found guns in, I think it was 0.2% of every single stop that they had. 0.2% of the stops ended in finding a gun. The rest were mainly just racial profiling. So this would be a good disadvantage. Also, the stop and frisk disadvantage would be able to link into a constitutionality framework as well, because the stop and frisk policy actually would be against the 4th and 14th Amendments, and I believe they might have ruled on that already. So that'd be a good thing to start doing some research on. So the Fourth Amendment is very clearly violated. The Fourth Amendment, which explains the right to no unreasonable search and seizure. So what would happen is an unreasonable search and seizure would be you're just walking down the street and the cop is like, you know what, you're the person who I'm going to stop and frisk. That's probably unreasonable because they have no suspicion, they have no warrant, they have no ability to actually do this in the first place. So that would not be a reasonable stop. So that would be against the Constitution. Along with the 14th Amendment, which requires equal protection of the law to all individuals. If we're stopping mainly 80% minority males, that's probably not equal protection under the law because they are minorities who are specifically being targeted for these actions because they are, quote unquote, more likely to have these violent tendencies. So that would be violating the 14th Amendment as well. So those are important things to look at. You can have this impact back to racism, impact back to the Constitution, and just show that there's no solvency of the affirmative because they would barely ever actually find guns in these instances. People are just better at hiding them or they just don't bring them out with them if they think they're going to be stopped and frisked. So along with this, there's also different politics disadvantages. So you can advocate that if the plan is passed, if the idea of the affirmative is passed, Republicans are going to surge in the polls because people are going to be mad at the liberals for passing this. And that can cause someone like Donald Trump or another Republican to get into office, and you can show a bad impact of that. On the other side, you can say that it can promote more support for liberals and allow Hillary Clinton to get into office, which can, or Bernie Sanders to get into office. But you can argue, just like you could with Republicans, that there will be a bad impact, for example, in the China policy of Hillary Clinton or in the anti-immigration stance that Donald Trump takes. Along with this, you can also talk about how it would hurt Obama's political capital. The idea of political capital is one that the president only has so much power over Congress. So let's say you go to your friend and you're constantly being like, hey, do you want to buy me a soda? I promise I'll pay you back. The first time they'll probably be like, sure, absolutely. But the 10th time you ask them for that favor and you haven't paid them back yet, they're probably not going to say it's okay anymore. Similarly to how Obama can't go to Congress and be like, hey guys, let's pass this bill. They'd be like, okay. The 10th time you ask them, they're not going to be as willing to pay. They're not going to be as willing to pass that bill, just like your friend won't be willing to pay for your soda every single time. So you can show how this plan, or the affirmative case in general, would take away from the political capital that Obama has, and ultimately cause them not be able to pass an important bill, such as the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, allowing for more trade with our Pacific Island partners and countries in Asia. So this can be really important, and it can cause a lot of economic and impacts, which could all lead to nuclear war or something like that. So those disadvantages will help you fight against the util affirmative cases, which may be true on a small scale, but you can show how the plan on a large scale would implicate the world in a very negative manner. So if you want more information regarding this topic, be sure to check out our January-February briefs. I helped cut some of the cards on there, and there's some great topic analyses, some great pieces of evidence, and I totally recommend you check it out. Thanks so much for listening. Bye!